If you're fascinated by royal power struggles, complex political schemes, and epic battles, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I will be reviewing Henry VI, Part 3 by William Shakespeare. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at another one of the history plays. Admittedly, one of the harder history plays to exactly understand because it is part of what I personally think to be the weakest of the trilogy. Actually, this is frequently also coupled with another one of the history plays, Richard III, to make up this tetrarchy of four plays. So the three parts of Henry VI and Richard III tend to go together. They weren't written sequentially. They were kind of hodgepodge, and so that is one of the things that makes them a little bit of a challenge to understand. So let's make sure we understand what is going on. I will give you, as usual, my act by act summary, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I think of this play and who I think this play is and isn't for. Starting in Act 1, we start with York challenging Henry's right to the throne. The country is deeply divided, with supporters for both sides rallying. So despite a temporary compromise that allows Henry to remain king while promising the throne to York's line after Henry's death, tensions only increase. Margaret is fiercely loyal to her son's claim and refuses to accept this deal. Meanwhile, York's sons, Edward and Richard, are ready to fight, and this act sets up a fierce dynastic battle where allegiances are not easily defined and compromise feels impossible. In Act 2, Margaret and Clifford kill York in a brutal scene. His sons, particularly Richard, react with intense grief and rage, spurring their desire for revenge. So the death of York only fuels the fire of conflict, and the act ends with the House of York mobilizing for battle against Henry's forces. You can really feel the cycle of violence here. The killing of one side's leader only prompts more bloodshed in return and makes it into what will eventually be a rather deadly war. In Act 3, with York's sons taking the field, Edward secures victories that bring him closer to the crown. He's even crowned king, while Henry, now in exile, wanders the countryside. This act is about power shifting hands as Edward's leadership is affirmed and the play starts to focus more on his rule. Henry, meanwhile, seems more like a tragic figure caught up in a game he can't control. In Act 4, we see division even among Edward's own ranks. Warwick, once an ally, is disillusioned by Edward's choice of bride and switches sides. Margaret returns from France, united with Warwick, ready to claim the throne for her son. Henry is briefly restored to the throne, but it's clear that his position is weaker than ever, and this whole act really emphasizes the theme of just betrayal and loyalties that shift constantly, and that no one is safe from being abandoned. Finally, in Act 5, the play concludes in a violent showdown. Edward and his brothers successfully defeat the forces of Warwick and Margaret. Henry, who is a passive figure in all this, is captured and killed by Richard, who is already starting to scheme for power. This act wraps up the tragic tale with a ruthless end, and Richard's ambition for the throne is clearly setting stage for what is going to become Richard III and the final in this tetralogy. I would say overall, Henry VI, Part 3 is perhaps the most intense of the three plays in this series, or the Henry VI parts. The Richard III is also quite intense too. I'd say that one gives a run for its money. But anyways, you certainly have Shakespeare digging deeply into these themes of loyalty and ambition and the human cost of endless war. That's actually not something that I think you see as often. He certainly has lots of discussion of betrayal and ambition in all of his other plays, but I think that this perspective of war just being an overall negative for the country, that's not always as present. So I thought that was something that was a little distinct. I will say that the violence in this play definitely feels pretty raw and personal, and the conflicts between the families is just something to really be frustrated at how significant that has on the rest of the country that is essentially two feuding families. I mean, Shakespeare also gives us a fascinating insight into the psychology of power and shows us how betrayal can become almost second nature in a battle of control. I will say one of the things that's interesting with the final play being Richard III, I particularly enjoyed the seeds of Richard's character development here as we're seeing it being developed for the upcoming Richard III play. Some of the things that make this an interesting play, I mean, so Shakespeare really dives, deep into the darkest phase of the War of the Roses in this one, and so he dramatizes just really intense horrors and moral breakdowns of a nation at war, and it's believed to have been written around 1591. and the play is set during Henry VI's lifetime, and it follows the descent from political unrest into brutal civil unrest. And you can see that in this play, but you can also tell that there's going to be even more beyond this, especially if you know history of the War of the Roses. And so while the first play in the series focuses on the loss of England's territories in France and the initial political scheming, and the second play focuses on Henry's inability to unify his feuding nobles, it is here in the third part that he really thrusts us into the heart of the chaos, where families are torn apart and moral boundaries dissolve into this desperate scramble for revenge and power. Well, even though Shakespeare may not have written Henry VI's plays in chronological order, they are frequently grouped, especially with Richard III, to create this tetralogy that covers the entire War of the Roses saga, which is something that I find fascinating about those four plays, is that they take such an important part of English history, they divide it up among these four plays, and you have very different tones in all four plays, but you do by the end actually get it all covered. And so we're going all the way from Henry V's death in 1492 up till the rise of Henry VII in 1485. So these four plays are covering quite a bit of material, but it is quite chronological and really interesting. The success of this sequence is really established in Shakespeare's reputation as a playwright, and it showcases his ability to capture the intensity and complexity of historical events by, of course, taking some generous liberties in the dialogue and what exactly got said between people, but by continuing to use events that did actually happen. I will say one thing that's distinct about this is just the sheer number of battle scenes. I believe there's at least 4 onstage battle scenes. That's a lot, and then at least one other that's referenced offstage. And so all of that, of course, makes this one of the most action-packed of the Shakespeare plays. So who would I say this play is for? My experience is not everyone is a fan of Shakespeare's history plays, and then if they are, there's only a handful that people tend to read. This is not going to be one of them. I do think that Henry IV and Henry V are generally much better received. King John, Richard III, I feel like all of those are ones that I have seen more renditions of. I think because of the title alone, it makes it a challenge for people to want to read this play, because it suggests that you read the other 2 plays as well. And even though Shakespeare didn't actually write them in that order, I think there is certainly this sense that I can't appreciate this play if I didn't read the other 2. I don't know if that's entirely true. I especially think if you just look up a quick summary of the other 2 plays, you can still enjoy this play. And I also think that the tone of each of these plays is different enough that there's something that you would enjoy in this that you might not find in the others. That being said, it is still a relatively obscure play for someone to just be reading. If you are looking specifically for histories, this would be middling to lower tier. And then if you're looking at the totality of Shakespeare's plays, it would certainly be on the lower end of what I would suggest for people to read. But it is fascinating because it does cover a real and an incredibly important part of English history. So I think all of that does give it some additional reason why you might want to read it. Not that it's going to help you actually pass any kind of AP test on English history if you're going to base it off of what you've read here. So who is this not for? I would say, well, if you're not a fan of Shakespeare, you're certainly not going to enjoy this. It's just like any Shakespeare, it's going to be full of wordplay. It's going to be complicated. There's a lot that you have to keep track of. So if none of that appeals to you, then this play is not going to be for you. If you're just getting into Shakespeare, I wouldn't recommend this. And not because it's not necessarily a good play, but I have been a big fan of making sure that you are aware of the social value of reading a Shakespeare play. And what I mean by that is, if no one knows what you're talking about, if you're going to reference this play, then that really dramatically decreases just how useful it is in terms of referencing it as a Shakespearean work. Or if you want to see a performance of it, you're going to be hard pressed to find one if this just doesn't have the same social impact as some of his other plays. That being said, I certainly don't think everything you read should have that kind of calculation, but I'd also say that I just don't think it is the best of his works, and so I would tend to recommend quite a few other works before this. It is not his worst. To be clear, he has several tragedies and a couple histories that I think are considerably worse than this and much harder to read. And so for those reasons, I would just have to put this right in the middle. And so if you're new to Shakespeare, I definitely wouldn't suggest this. If you have some experience with Shakespeare, I'd say, well, maybe, but there's probably still a couple others that I would choose over this. And that is what I would say about this play in terms of who I would and wouldn't recommend it for. But I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.